Today's presentation is going to be presented by Sandra Nader. I had an awesome opportunity and am inspired because I got to meet Sandra last week at the Swiss Diversity Awards. So I'm very excited about today's presentation. Now, before I stop talking and give the floor to Sandra, just a couple of things about today. I will be collecting your questions. If you would like to type them in the chat, Sandra will also pause for a moment. If you would like to ask any questions, I ask that you please, if you aren't typing them and you would like to verbally speak them, raise your hand using that function in Zoom, and I will go ahead and call on you with your question for Sandra. Now, thank you very much. Sandra, I would like to turn it over to you to begin today's talk.
Thank you very much, Christian, and the whole team for the lovely introduction and the tech support. I feel very honored to be able to close off this Diversity Week. Thank you so much, University of St. Gallen, for making this happen. Yes, as you've already heard, my name is Sandro. I use he, they pronouns, and I'm a former biologist turned professional trans person. I'm the senior manager at TGNS, Transgender Network of Switzerland, and I work at AIDS-Hilfe Schweiz, an organization for STI and HIV prevention and treatment in the Department of Trans Health. And today we're going to have a little talk about trans people, and especially trans people in the workplace. The aim of this is for you to we do a little Transo 101, so find basic informations. What is gender? How is it to be trans? How can I support trans people? And then especially how to include trans people in the workplace in a mutually beneficial way. Good, perfect. This is how we move on. This is this week's program. We're the last one standing. This is me, and we have our sponsors. Perfect. We're gonna move on. So, what is gender? Who is trans? What do we do in Switzerland? And what have we done in the past? The one thing everyone needs is best practice. And we're going to talk a little bit about how everyone can benefit from trans people. I would like to start out with some questions for you. You don't need to say anything or raise your hand if you feel uncomfortable or if you do want to like to share. But if you do feel comfortable, I would ask you to use the raise your hand function or to raise your hand on camera. If you know any trans people in your life, at work, privately, anywhere, sports, whatever. See a little who does raise their hand. Okay, so it's a few people. As you see, you think you know who is trans. So it's very interesting. People are like, oh yeah, I know, or I don't know anybody. How do you want to know who is trans? You might write emails with them every day. You might have phone calls with them every day. You might see them at work. They might be your clients, your supervisors, your students. It's a bit the joke of the story. You can't really be sure if we are trans or not, because there's a lot of trans people everywhere. In Switzerland, between 0.5% and 6% of population, depending on how you assess the data, consider themselves trans. So that's at least 50,000 people, which is quite a lot considering what kind of small country that we are. Perfect. The next 3 questions, I'm going to give you like 3-ish minutes. And you can answer them for yourself. I highly encourage you to write down, jot it down quickly, what it is for you. I will love to go and share what it is for me. And maybe you find some time later on or on the weekend to reflect on these questions, and maybe also after this presentation, there's a bit of a different outlook on it. So yeah, the question is, what is your gender at the moment? Do you even have a gender? Do you feel comfortable with the gender? Maybe yes, maybe no. Why? And also, what experiences are linked to your gender and how do they make you feel? I think we'll take 3 minutes and we'll be back. I would suggest we slowly return to the presentation. I hope you found some interesting answers for yourself. So I will quickly share what it is for me. Maybe you get to know me a bit better, and also maybe you can take something out of it for yourself. So what's your gender? Do you have one? I do have a gender. And I consider myself to be male. Um, I am also very often considered trans. And I find this very funny because the male part of it comes from me. That's myself, that's how I feel. The trans part comes from other people. That's how society sees me, right? It is both equally part of my identity as a member of this society, right? Because without a group, there's no society, so it's me and others. But it has two parts to it. There is how I feel, and there is how it's in the context of society. I do feel very comfortable with it. I do feel most comfortable when there's nobody around, though, because very frequently, as you interact with society, being male is very cool. Being trans is not so cool, right? One of my favorite examples is always when I used to present more as a woman. If I went to the mechanic with my car or whatever, I could tell him exactly what was wrong. He still wouldn't believe me. Today, if I go as a male presenting person, even if I don't exactly know what's wrong, I can tell him some bullshit, the catalyzer, or I don't know, and he will still check exactly that. So that's a very fun part and a very comfortable part of male privilege to explore. It's less comfortable if you're out in society and people see that you're trans, and that's all of a sudden the only thing that they see. This is also why we're talking not just about being trans, but also about being gender, because those two things, they go very closely together. There's no one without the other. And then what experiences are linked to your gender? How do they make you feel? There's a vast array of experiences linked to my gender, and there's probably more experiences linked to my gender than were if I were cis, right? If I were not trans. Because a lot of my life has reviewed on finding my place in society with my gender, despite the fact that I just wanted to find a place. I didn't really want the gender to be that big of a part of it. So it makes me feel glad to some degree that I had the opportunity to explore this and to find this place to be exposed to that. And on the other hand, it sometimes makes me feel like I lost a lot of resources to it. So that's my short answers to these very complex questions. I suggest you read them a little bit for yourself. But now we're gonna move on, which seems to be more difficult today than planned. So voila. This is my little friend. Don't know if you've met them before. This is the gender unicorn. And it's there to talk a little bit about gender, because in English we're kind of blessed. We have sex and we have gender, right? In German we only have das Geschlecht, which is a bit of an issue, and even then it's fairly complicated. So we have here three variants of gender. We have a biological sex, right? We have a gender expression, and we have a gender identity. One kind of gender is missing. It's the legal gender, right? Something that's very frequently talked about these days, legal gender recognition. So it's not just about your biology, but also what's on paper. We're quickly going to go through them one by one. So you have the opportunity to learn a bit about each one of them. Obviously, me being a former biologist, we're going to talk about biology first, and then we're going to go on. And you will see, like, they're not necessarily as linked as you think they are, and they're fairly nuanced. So yeah, we have a biological sex and a gender assigned at birth, right? I'm sure you all have some, or most of you probably have some form of academic training. So you know, we have genetics, right? We have genes that are on our DNA. They're basically like the recipes on how to build a human. And within every single one of your cells, there's a bit more than a meter of DNA, which is entirely too much for this tiny space. So we have to somehow create law and order. So that if we want to cook an eye, we find the recipe for an eye, the gene for an eye, and not just some random, I don't know, gene for a hand, right? It would be kind of creepy. So we take this very long DNA, we wind it up, allow little proteins, we squish it together, and we get these chromosomes, right? We get these X-shaped forms, 23 times 2. You get each one of them once from one of your parents and one from the other one of your parents. So you have a double set, which is the shit, because if the recipe or gene for how to make eyes, how to make noses, etc., is damaged on one, you still have the other one. So it kind of is really an advantage to mammals. And the last part of these chromosome sets, the 23rd pair, is X and Y. And I'm pretty sure you've all heard already of X and Y chromosomes. You need an X. The X has very important things for brain development on it, and you kind of do need a brain as a human, believe it or not. So you always have an X. The question is, do you need a Y? You don't really need a Y. You need one X. If you get a double X, right, very often people say, oh, that's going to be a girl. That's not really the full truth. If you get a double X, one X is silenced because you only need one X for expression. If you do get XY, you also don't really need that much of the things that are on the Y chromosome. The very interesting part about this Y chromosome, it's kind of tiny, has little arms. On one of the outside of these arms is a gene that's called SRY gene. And that's the gene that makes you produce testicles. Testicles produce hormones that create a penis. So, tiny bit oversimplified, you need one gene to make a penis. It's like a light switch. You turn it on or you turn it off. If it's there, you get a penis. If it's not there, no penis for you, very often. And this is kind of funny because, right, like to create the eye color, you need about a dozen genes. To create a hair cell, you need even more genes. To create a penis, it's the one gene that starts it all. And yet we kind of decided to split up society by this one thing. It's the same for skin color, by the way. There's not that many genes involved in skin pigmentation. Still, we kind of decided that's how we separate society. So if you have a Y with an SRY gene on it, you have a penis. If not, you don't. What can happen is that either you get more than 2 of these last chromosome sets, so you have 3 or 4 or just 1. Humans survive that fairly nicely. That's considered being genetically intersex. Maybe some of you are familiar with the term hermaphrodite, right? This comes from euthanasia theory in the Third Reich, so we don't use that anymore. We talk of these people as genetically intersex. And what can also happen is that this tiny little arm of the Y chromosome breaks off, right? There's a shit ton of things going on in a cell. It's really tight for space and everything. So if it breaks off, it can be that your body looks at it and goes, don't really get it, and just disposes of it. Then it's gone, and you still have XY chromosomes. If your parent went to the doctor for prenatal checkups and they were like, oh yeah, it's going to be a person with a penis, and then there is no person with a penis, or it's just attached to another chromosome, and then you still get a penis, despite the fact that you might just be XX. So this is kind of important to understand because people always bring out this story of like biology only makes the 2 sexes, right? And even if you study biology today, that's not really mentioned. Well, it's actually, nature creates a whole array of sexes already, and we're not even at gender. As a fetus develops, right, cells multiply, you get the genitalia and the gametes out of the same tissue, right? Either the tissue turns into a clitoris, or turns into a penis, it turns into testes, or it turns into ovaries. And this gives us the possibility for a great array of different sex expressions, right? And sometimes they're not easily categorizable into penis, testicle, typically male, and vulva, vagina, uterus. And that's when we talk of visible intersex genitalia. And it's something that's considered extremely rare, despite the fact that it's not that rare. In Switzerland, it's about 40 to 60 kids a year. That's more common than some of the common heart defects. And we're the only country in Europe where doing surgery on intersex children is not forbidden. In all of EU, it's forbidden, and many other non-EU countries, it's forbidden as well. So it's really a fairly Swiss problem at this point. And you see the problem, obviously, if you operate on children's genitalia to make them fit more into a binary sex category. You don't know what kind of genitals a child needs later on to be happy. This is just biological sex, right? We're not yet a gender identity. So in biological sex, we have a whole spectrum of possibilities for anatomy, for hormones, for everything. Once you're born, somebody's gonna look between your legs and it's gonna take a wild guess depending on what they see there. Generally, when they see a penis, they're gonna guess it's gonna be a boy. When they see a vulva, they're probably gonna guess it's gonna be a girl. Right? If you fit into neatly these two categories, you have a vulva with a uterus, a vagina, etc., if penis with testes, etc., you're called endosex. People, as we already talked about it, that don't fit into these binary sex categories, they're called intersex. After this wild guess, depending on what's between your legs, you will be assigned male at birth, AMAB, or assigned female at birth, AFAB, right? And it's wild. That's normally the first question that people ask after birth is what's between the legs. They don't want to know hair color, skin color, eye color, anything else. That's very obviously visible. That's what they're going for. So it does have a tremendous impact coming from this tiny little gene to our sex anatomy as we see it on how somebody's perceived in life. As you grow up, generally somewhere between the 2nd and the 5th year of life, people do find their identity, which is very early on that children start to realize, okay, we live in society where there's different roles, there's different expectations. Boys get the cars, girls get the pink stuff, etc. And if we leave children, they figure that out fairly easily by themselves. There's quite a lot of data on that, going back already a while. You can develop a binary gender identity, meaning you identify you are a man or a woman. You can also develop a non-binary gender identity, and this means people who don't fall into either category, man or woman. This can be people who say, I'm neither, I'm both. Sometimes I'm the one, sometimes I'm the other. It can also be people who say, I have no gender, right? Remember the question at the beginning? Or people who say, I just don't give a fuck. And that's valid too. Being non-binary is as old as time, right? We find it in the hieroglyphs, we find it in the Greeks, we find it in many, many altar cultures up until colonialism, which largely erased that kind of heritage. If your gender identity, quote unquote, matches with the wild guess your doctor took when you were a baby and were born, you're cis. Sure, some of you are familiar with the term, means on this side. So you're on the side of the gender that was assigned to you at birth. And if you are not, if they weren't guessing correctly when you were born, right? You're trans, you're on the other side of the guess or on a other side of the guess. This is fairly important terminology to use because very often people say, I'm normal and you're trans. I'm equally normal, right? So you're just cis and I'm trans. The most famous things always that people is like, oh yeah, I can tell somebody's gender because I don't know, spaghetti straps are kind of out at the moment for men or whatever. Gender expression isn't really the same as gender identity. People very often use gender expression to affirm their gender identity, but it's not the same, meaning it's what you see from the outside and what you interpret into it depending on your age, depending on your cultural background, on your social environment, etc. And it forms quite deeply, right? And I find it very funny because like my mom used to still be called Fräulein, Mademoiselle, right? And she used to wear exclusively skirts, right? When she grew up, pants were too male, too masculine, God forbid. And that's not that long ago. And today we all wear pants, it's business attire, nobody cares. Funny enough, vice versa with the skirt, it's not the same, right? Which tells us a lot about how patriarchy works. The quote unquote male standard is fine to have, but the quote-unquote female standard is not as freely adaptable. It tells us a lot about how we work in society. It also depends on many factors. I just talked about age. It depends about culture. A lot of cultures do not assign what we see in Europe as generally feminine or generally masculine with femininity or masculinity, right? If we stay with the skirt example, if you call a person in a kilt a woman because they wear a skirt, they're probably not going to be very happy with you. We also have social environment, right? If I grew up in a very accepting environment, I might feel more free to express my gender. If I am living in a very unaccepting environment or under a lot of pressure, if you have to fit into social norms because I have to represent a role, maybe also a role that's generally considered only trustworthy if it's within a binary gender expression, I might not feel as free to express that. And it, among other things, also has largely to do with economic status. We will later on see trans people are fairly economically disadvantaged, which also just is really a thing that expressing your gender costs money. Buying clothes, buying shoes, buying makeup, going to the hairdresser, wearing the right kind of things, that's all hella expensive. And that's a privilege people have, whether cis or trans, is to express themselves regardless of what it costs. So, who is trans? People who are not assigned a gender at birth that does not match their gender identity. Meaning, if they didn't guess right at your birth, you're trans. That should be fairly easy to understand. It doesn't depend on whether somebody has outed themselves, whether they transitioned in any way, shape, or form, whether they look like it, etc. It's something that comes from me as a person. It's a self-ascribed thing. I found that out for myself. It has nothing to do with external validation in terms of, am I allowed to be trans? How do I have to behave? It has something to do with the outside world because you consider being cisgender the norm. That's a bit the confusing part, right? They look at you, they name you trans, but only you can really say whether you're trans or not. I suggest we take a quick break for first questions before we move on. So just so we don't lose anybody. Are there already any pressing questions around any things that are unclear? No? Perfect. Otherwise, feel free to write them in the chat and we'll move on. Perfect. So what's the situation of trans people in Switzerland, largely in regards to the working environment? We have a project called Trans Welcome that I will explain to you later on. And we were able to generate some data. And we found out that about 20% of all employable trans people are unemployed, right? Which is crazy high. Most of them almost up to 2 years. This has a ginormous impact on the socioeconomic well-being of trans people, but also of their communities, right? If a lot of the people around you that you're close with that can support you in a certain matter are unemployed, you lack very often professional connections, right? In German, we have this nice word called vitamin B. You like the kind of backdoor access to things. You might not have anybody who can really help you maneuver, especially if you out yourself as an adult trans person. Which leads to the next problem, which is 1/3 of outing ends in job loss. In Switzerland, we have this lovely law that says you're protected against discrimination based on your gender. That means based on whether you're a woman or a man. That doesn't necessarily include trans people, which means it's fairly legal for people to quit or to end somebody's employment after they're outed. Very often they also end it on things like they are a disturbance to the team, they're no longer representable to clients, etc. Again, huge difficulties because very often outing yourself already comes with a lot of stress and pressure on yourself. Losing your job is the last thing you want to do. Half of all trans people experience violence in the workplace, discrimination, assault, you name it, it has been there. Which again, like doesn't necessarily benefit your career and most certainly doesn't benefit your mental health. And unemployed trans people cost the state more than 60 millions a year, which is a shit ton of money in capitalism. And it would be really good to kind of invest some of that money probably into training rather than into paying unemployment benefits for trans people. Really important to understand this 20% number of trans people, they're not unemployed because they're mentally ill, which is also a fair reason to be unemployed, but they're unemployed because the discrimination is so high that they cannot find jobs or unlivable wages, right? This is really, really something that's impacting the community very, very deeply. And it comes with another problem, which is trans people aren't very visible in the work environment. Very often people, when they approach us, they're like, I'm the only trans person I've ever known or I've ever seen in work. And it creates a huge problem for young trans people coming up because they don't see themselves working in any field. We have job advisory, and if they're asked, if you ask young trans people that approach them, what would you like to do for a living? They are very often on a thing of like, I don't know, I've never seen a job for trans people that's good. Also, sometimes they answer other than sex work, right? Which isn't a very nice thing if you don't actually want to do sex work. So this is really a very sad situation that we're currently in. And we can change that together. That's not the major issue. We have the project Trans Welcome. It's a sister project of TGNS, providing workshop, counseling, etc., for employers and employees that have to do with the topic of being trans in the workplace, etc. We have the Transgender Network Switzerland. You find a shit ton of information on our webpage if you're interested or informed. And we have the Trans Safety Emergency Fund, which is kind of the very sad birth of the slide you've just previously seen. It provides trans people with emergency support financially, right? So these are informations or organizations that you can go to after this little lecture if you want more information. What are we going to do about it? We can go on for hours and hours being philosophical about gender, but it's not really going to change much for trans people. So we're going to have a look. Currently in everybody's mouth, quite literally, we have gender neutral language. Use gender neutral language in English much easier than in German. So I will give you a few examples in English. I'll give you a few examples in German, right? When you address somebody in English, state maybe hello, first name, last name, and not Miss, Mrs., or Mr. Some people who would like to be addressed with Miss, Mrs., or Mr., but are non-binary use MX, right, as a shortening to kind of acknowledge their non-binarity and that they don't really fall within these terms. Use gender-neutral language when talking about your clients, your products, your employees, right? Say, for example, something I always heard in science was like, oh, this is a very male behavior when it came to animals. And the joke was always a bit like it for the animals, it wasn't male at all, but for humans, it was something that we thought was very butch, very masc. So really try to practice your gender neutral language. Also in German, right? We have, for example, if you start your emails, your letters off saying Guten Tag, Vorname, Nachname, or liebe Angestellte, liebe Besuchende. And sometimes we have the problem with, in German, everything is gendered, right? So we also have the thing of if you need to use a gendered term, you can use an asterisk, you can use an underscore or different signs that are out there to account for this gender neutrality or for gender diversity, which means you can use liebe LehrerInnen, for example, using little asterisks, points, or an underline. Pronouns, they kind of go in the same thing, right? Like pronouns, I left them behind me somewhere in 4th grade German class. It was always my big hatred until I became trans. And use your pronouns and introduce yourself with them. So next time you start off a meeting with somebody, you give a lecture or whatever, why not say, hey, my name is Sandro Nieder, I use he, they pronouns. I always highly encourage you always do it, not just when you suspect that a sneaky trans person might be in your class or around in your workspace. You can put it in your email footer, close off your emails with it, put it in Zoom calls. Whatever can help people to address you correctly and help others address correctly. Because if you're cis and you look it and you look like a man and you use he and pronouns, it's fairly easy to be addressed correctly, right? By you doing it, you normalize it for everyone. Gender neutral spaces and clothing.
No.
Is it a question?
Wait.
I don't think so. Otherwise, you can write it in the chat. Thank you. Gender neutral spaces and closing.
Okay,
Changing
thank you
rooms.
very much. Ciao, ciao. Thank you. See you.
Gender neutral spaces, so bathrooms, wardrobes, all these kind of spaces, make them gender neutral, right? Very easy. Slap a little paper on the door that says just toilets or showers or whatever. They're gender neutral. It allows for people that might not stereotypically look like one or the other to find a space where they feel safest. Just statistically speaking, there have been practically no assaults on cis people by trans people. It's funny enough, always the other way around. So it's not actually cis women who are the vulnerable population, but trans people. Clothing as well, if you have to have lab coats or scrubs or just business attire, allow people to dress the way they feel comfortable. It frees up a lot of capacity. My favorite one is people always come to me and says, like, it's really hard to talk in gender neutral language and to use gender neutral pronouns or somebody else's pronouns or whatever. Honest apologies and making an effort go really, really far, right? If you misgender somebody, if you use the wrong pronouns, there's no harm in just saying, oh, I'm very sorry, and do it better next time. We know whether you're making fun of us or trying, I don't know, to upset us or to disrespect us, or whether it was an honest mistake. You will only get better by practicing. We are probably not going to feel offended if you say an honest sorry. Best practice. 2, if you lead, you are the role model. We see this very often. If the boss is cool with trans people, everyone else is cool with trans people. If the boss isn't cool with trans people, everyone orients themselves on the person that leads a team or the person that first addresses the topic. So I really suggest, if you're a team leader, read up on it, especially if you have trans people on the team, especially if somebody outs themselves to you. Read up on it. Don't be scared to say that you don't know. What you should be scared of is saying that you don't know and then not doing anything. There's a distinct difference there. So take a time, have a look at it, learn about it, and then lead with acceptance and lead with honesty. If you don't know what to do, why not ask a trans person what they would like you to do? We are experts on our own existence. So chances are pretty high you're gonna learn from us the most. Make changes after outings. If somebody outs themselves at your workspace, change their name on their work ID, change their name in the system, give them a new email address. Maybe also, if you have somewhere, I don't know, in your employment contracts, little cross where it's Mr. or Miss, see if you can erase that if it has to be binary, right? Is it important on your work ID to say female or male? Probably not. Help make these changes. You proactively signal to trans people that you really want to help them make a transition into be part of your team. We have a right to privacy. If you know somebody is trans, you don't need to inform your colleagues. That's on the trans people to figure out. If they want to inform, maybe it doesn't matter for them. I've been out for 10 years. If I weren't a trans person by profession, probably most people wouldn't know, right? Give them that, but also acknowledge that whilst our bodies, our lives, our sexualities, etc., shouldn't be a taboo, they shouldn't be, they're still our private matter. So asking somebody about their intimate relationships, etc., in the name of I want to educate myself is really rude and disrespectless and disrespectful. So really ask what you need to know to treat a person nicely, pronouns, names, etc. You don't need to know what's between somebody's legs and somebody's passport and somebody's past or bedroom. And kind of the same streak, get your knowledge from paid sources. There's a lot of projects out there that have information for you, either freely available or with workshops that you can train yourself in that were produced by people that were paid for their work. There's nothing worse than if you have to go to work and always educate everybody on everything, right? It's very funny when I still used to work in a lab, whenever it came to something remotely related to gender or sex, my boss would stand in my tiny little office and be like, so what do we do now? And you're there and you're like, I don't know what we're exactly doing now, because I'm not exactly familiar with mice penis. And it's not very appropriate to expect every trans person to help you educate yourself continuously. So why is this beneficial, not just for us, but also for you? We're hella resilient. Trans people go through a lot. We have to have a lot of patience. We know the system very well. We have dealt with our bodies intensely. We have dealt with other people's existences, generally more in depth than a lot of other people. This gives us a lot of resilience. Who doesn't want a person on their team who's fairly resilient, who's patient, who has probably developed fairly nicely social skills on the way? It's authenticity. If you as an employer want a well-working team, you know that one of the key factors is authenticity. Nobody wants to work in a fake team, not even in the age of capitalism. So allow trans people to be themselves. It allows other people to be themselves as well. And you might learn very fun things about other people on your team, other people at your workplace, how they might like their life, what kind of backgrounds they have, what they contribute to society outside of work. It also gives you a bit of critical lens of gender. And I find this one of the most worthy things to have is somebody breaks a gender, everyone around them automatically starts to slightly question their gender very often. This is why trans people so easily ruffle other people's feathers, because we all experience gender. We all experience gender every day. It's just if your gender deviates from the norm that it becomes a big topic to you. So it gives other people an opportunity to reflect on gender and reflect on gender in workspace. Are we really equally paid? Are we really equally treated? Is the person cleaning the coffee machine always a woman? Because the men have never figured out how to clean a coffee machine. It's the small things that you can really appreciate about it and see what it does to your team dynamics. And it gives you diversity. And diversity is something extremely valuable because our brains are super plastic. They learn all day long, they learn all lifelong, and informs how we think. And it greatly impacts how we address problems. And living in a society where you're not the norm forces your brain to develop great problem-solving skills, to develop great skills in terms of efficiency, in terms of planning, which for us very often isn't extremely beneficial in everyday life, but can be extremely beneficial in a career, in a workplace, to have people who have different ways of addressing problems. So being trans is something that actually kind of benefits everyone. And what I think you might learn about yourself as you deal with the topic of gender and gender in workplace is that we're all a little bit on the spectrum between men and women. And we can all benefit if we slide a little bit around every once in a while to feel where we are and what it does to our life. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them now. I think we're almost on time. Yes, we are. And also highly encourage you to look it up. If you have any questions afterwards, feel free to approach us via TGNS webpage. We're always here to help, especially when it comes to workplace related matters, but also otherwise. And I will give over to Christian for question moderation.
Thank you very much, Sandra. I really appreciate the approach that you took, the structure, and the key takeaways that I think will help us all be better leaders. Currently, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but if anyone has any questions that they would like to state, please go ahead and raise your hand.
It's Friday afternoon.
So while we wait for the audience and as they reflect, Sandra, I have a question. So this talk right now is virtual, and we're looking, at flex work, new work, remote work, part-time work versus full-time equivalents. When I look at a lot of the best practices that you've recommended, they seem really applicable in almost each one of those environments. But are there certain nuances that you would give allies when we're working mainly remotely, or when we have new team members who are joining and we don't necessarily have that in-person contact with them? What would be your advice to really kind of build the rapport around the team and make sure that that person feels inclusive or included and that they belong?
Yes, definitely. So, I mean, we move into this age of remote work, right? And when I add people to the team or jobs where we used to work a lot remotely, I would always ask them, regardless of whether they were trans or not, or whether I knew or not, how would you like to be addressed? How should I introduce you? Right? What do you want me to know about that? Because I feel very often we make assumptions, and a lot of trans people, you're with a new employer, you don't necessarily want to make yourself a special snowflake in their eyes from the beginning. So really, when you introduce new people into a workspace where we might not see each other, where I might not know who's behind that computer or this number, really introduce somebody and be like, hey, this is this and that person, they use this and that pronouns. It helps people really kind of just think about the topic. It also signals to cis people who might not have thought too much about it that that's part of your work environment. These people are welcome, they are part, they are here to stay, and they have to gain the knowledge to be part of it as well. Also, when you work with clients, right, very often remotely, there's no harm in stating your pronouns or using gender neutral language. The worst thing that can happen is that somebody looks at you a little bit and goes like, I don't exactly know what they mean, but why not ask, or why not Google? So you're having the chance to, with nuances, educate people on the way.
Thanks. I really appreciate that. Vera has a question, and what Vera is asking is, what changes have you noticed in the acceptance and visibility of trans people in society and the workplace over the past couple of years or the more recent years?
So in Switzerland, it's quite tremendous, right? Because we're a little bit behind on general Europe in some ways, and in other ways we've really come far. So you can now change your legal gender much more easily without pathologizing through psychiatric reviews, etc. It's also much cheaper that way. It's still hell expensive, but it's much cheaper. We have seen that it really became a lot more visible. When I think back 10 years ago, there was an odd story here or there in the news. There was also like only small local projects and offers for trans people, and that really kind of blew up via us being now a national network and organization. A lot of TV exposure, a lot of media exposure, and therefore it's also easier for us to come out in the workplace, right? One thing that we're still aiming to achieve is legal gender recognition of non-binary people, which is actually right now, as we're speaking, at the Bundeshaus being discussed. So that's very exciting for us. The downside a little bit of it is that with more exposure, we get more backlash. So hatred on trans people, both politically and in media and interpersonally, has become a lot more normalized in the last few years. which is obviously also very concerning for us.
Thank you. We also have a comment from Carmen, which I will read and then go back to Angelica's question. Carmen wrote, I often get to hear that oneself has no issue with trans, but they are concerned what clients, customers, partners think. Personally, my experience is that people, after getting to know me, have no problems. So it would be very helpful to not assume what others think. P.S. I'm a female trans.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you for joining. I think very often it's really, we've created this narrative of being professional is a white, cis, heterosexual, able-bodied man in a suit, right? That can work 9 to 5 and has a wife at home taking care of everything else in life. And it's very detached from reality. And what people crave is connection, right? And very often management looks just what they described, you know, they look at it and they're like, oh, that's not presentable. Clients won't like it. People won't like it. When actually people like authenticity. People like people being themselves because it makes you feel like you can be yourself. So I really share that experience that I was very often seen as highly unpresentable. And then when I was presented, people were like, oh yeah, he's human. I will take him for the offer, you know? So thank you for sharing that.
That's great. And Angelica's question, going back to it, is what can we as a society do if we catch people who misgender on purpose all the time because they refuse to respect others' gender and identity? It is hard to build a safe environment with people like this.
Definitely. So there's a difference between not knowing and hatred. Hatred is a choice, and you can make a choice to not tolerate that, which takes a lot of spine and not necessarily something we do in Swiss society, right? We're very neutral, we're very low key. So I really encourage you to stand up. I really encourage you to not just correct the person because they know the correct thing to do. They just choose to do something else. So you can state that you do not tolerate hatred and disrespect very clearly. I very often salespeople, you're like, I don't tolerate that around here. You know that the correct way to do it would be XYZ. You choose to disrespect that person. I understand that's very often difficult. Might not always the right moment to say that, especially when you're in meetings and group meetings. But I think it's always a good moment to stand up for your trans people that are around you. And it is hatred, it is discrimination, and therefore it can be a reason to remove somebody from a space, from a meeting, if somebody else's safety isn't guaranteed. Right? And it doesn't matter whether the person or trans people in general around are there. It's your job to stand up because it's unacceptable. And we really appreciate it if you do, because we will know, you know, we know who's the allies and who is just saying shit when we're there. So thank you for the question.
Just a quick follow-on question to that before we get into Melina's question. Because you bring up the topic of allyship. Have you seen any sponsorship programs in organizations for trans people?
Sponsorship for what? There is some.
So great question. To clarify, when we look at sponsorship, it's kind of that step beyond allyship where senior leaders are really creating opportunities or pulling trans people up in the organization to give them chances that traditionally weren't given to them.
Yeah, so there is, as far as I know, there's no project specifically focusing on trans people, which is very sad because especially like around June, you know, everybody is very trans friendly and then somehow the rest of the year it kind of mellows out very quickly. No, we have not. We do offer training that sometimes can help if people don't have the social or professional network to reach that next step in their job. And we do work with different companies to help them see more the value in their trans employees and maybe also the perception they have of them in terms of, oh, you're not worthy to take the next step in career or the next step in mentoring.
Thank you for that. So Melina's question is, would you suggest to rather ask for someone's pronouns or just tell your own to not out anyone forcefully?
Okay, I think that's a very good question. Thank you very much. The thing with the pronouns is always a rubric I can get hella awkward if you're there and you don't really want to share your pronouns. I always suggest in a group setting, don't force anyone. So if I open up a meeting, I will not go to anybody and be like, you all have to share your pronouns, right? So I normally suggest, I will share my pronouns, please feel free to share yours. This gives people wanting to share the opportunity, and it normalizes it kind of also in a softer way. And in a one-on-one interaction, I always introduce myself with my pronouns. Very often the other person introduces themselves with their pronouns. If they don't, I normally don't ask as a form of respect. If it comes to a point where I should know because I have to fill out any legal papers or anything else, I will normally just ask them in a under four eyes manner, be like, okay, I would need to know, would you feel comfortable sharing with me? Perfect.
All about creating that psychologically safe space.
Exactly.
So, Vera has another question. Have you observed certain industries to be more open or progressive about trans or LGBTQ plus inclusion than others?
Yes and no. So you find a lot of LGBTIQ, especially trans people, non-binary people in arts, right? Which is always a bit of question, are trans people predispositioned somewhat genetically for artistic endeavors? So far, no. But one thing that has been really driving that is kind of like, it's exotic, it's different. So we look at it as art. We like to be entertained by it, quite frankly, right? We have industries where a lot of people work behind a computer, especially the IT industry, which sometimes gives trans people an advantage, right? Also younger industries, the IT industry isn't that old, so structures have not yet that deeply embedded. We see a lot of trans people pursuing careers in IT. And then there's really kind of trans people everywhere, and it really depends on the organization and the leadership. One thing that's very fascinating is that, especially in professions where people travel a lot, historically, there have been a lot of LGBTIQ people because of persecution and because of being able to go away and live your life as it is important to you. But that's kind of the standard, and we're everywhere.
Thank you very much for that response, Sandra. I think we have time for perhaps one more quick question if anybody in the audience has one. And if not, I have one final question for you, Sandra, which is, if there would be one key takeaway in one sentence that you would have our audience think about, what would that be?
That's a very good question. I think what it would be is, if you reflect on gender, you're going to learn a lot about our society, and you're going to become a master of authenticity and truth, and therefore it will give you a great power to uphold a team and a workspace. That was not one sentence, but if you make every full stop a comma, that's one sentence.
I appreciate that.
Perfect.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for your time, your perspective, your answers to our questions, and helping us all grow together to become better allies for each other, but also make workplaces more inclusive. Really, really appreciate it, Sandro. Thank you so much.